Hi there, Z-Manzilla here, and I wanted to take just a moment, if I could, to discuss something that's come up a lot during my recent reviews, specifically the concept of permadeath. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, permadeath, at least in the context of SnapMaps, is when a map is designed to trigger an endgame condition, typically the defeat screen, the first time the player dies. It's a common mechanic in many video games, and you may also recognize it as the endgame condition used by real life. Permadeath is used by many map makers for a variety of reasons, which include, but are not limited to, projecting a greater sense of challenge, easy to program, and, new map makers who simply feel that this is a standardized and sensible way to end a snap map. Now, I have gone on record in the past as saying that I like there to be a consequence for the player dying, and permadeath is as good a consequence as any. However, I've recently been coming around to the idea that while a consequence for death is necessary to prevent players from just patiently tanking their way through the entire map and all it has to offer, permadeath may not be the best way to handle that. Now, there are a few reasons for this, but the main reason I feel is most practical is the loading times. SnapMap loading times are easily the worst in the entire game. You have to sit through like 2 additional minutes of loading just to access SnapMap mode from the main menu to begin with. And then, each map takes an average of 1.5 minutes to load. Now, before you ask, no, I never actually timed it, but then again, I didn't have to. You see, when I'm editing my SnapMap reviews, I cut out the loading times, and those chunks of footage are consistently between 1:30 and 2 minutes. There's, by the way, an additional 15 to 20 seconds I also chop off at the end as well. Now, that's because of the time it takes to get from the endgame condition back to the game lobby. So, using these 2 pieces of information, let's just examine the experience of a player who hits one of the 2 endgame conditions in SnapMaps, those being either victory or defeat. Now, for a victory condition, no big deal. They completed the map, they experienced everything it was designed to offer, and 20 seconds later they're being asked to vote. Now, what happens when they're defeated? Well, they've completed the map, not everything it was designed to offer, and 20 seconds later they're being asked to vote. That's 20 seconds of waiting where they had time to stew in whatever conditions caused the game to be ended. Now, assuming for now that we're dealing with a level-headed and well-adjusted person who can be honest about their own skill deficiencies, and also assuming that the player's death was caused by a legitimate and reasonable threat that the player simply failed to plan for or address correctly, now the player may be inclined after that to go back and try the map again. So let's make a third somewhat less fantastic assumption, which is that the player doesn't mind redoing everything they did up to that point. After all that, there's still a little matter of having to sit through another 90 to 120 seconds of loading screen to do that. So this means that your best case scenario with permadeath is that your map is completely free of sneak attacks and environment hazards, and the only people dying in your map are level-headed and patient. Now, pretending for a moment that any challenging map can truly be said to be 100% gank-free, how many enthusiasts of AAA first-person shooters can you identify as patient and level-headed? Now, maybe you don't care about the voting. That's valid. Publishing for review is, of course, completely optional. However, unless you're only making boards for yourself, then player perception is crucial to your map experience. There's no single standardized way to say this is a good map and that one isn't, but generally speaking, when you call a map good, it's because the time you spend playing that map was a positive experience. You had fun. You were challenged. Something caught your attention in a positive or compelling way. Things like that. With this in mind, though, what is the effect of permadeath on the player experience? Well, it's an abrupt end, followed by a lot of waiting. It's a break in action outside the player's control that transitions them from having fun to doing nothing in an instant. Furthermore, if the really cool and juicy things you designed are at a point later in the map than when they died, it severely reduces the chances that the player will even see it. But Zilla, you may be saying, how can there be consequences for death if we can't program in dying? Well, that's a great question, and it's what I've been thinking about a lot lately, what ultimately drew me to create this video. I've come up with what I think are 6 alternate examples of punishing a character for dying, along with one other sort of alternate solution for dealing with it, and all of these work without immediately kicking a player to a loading screen abruptly. These are all based on things I've already seen in existing maps, with the exception of one that I'm actually currently working on with another map, and I'll point that one out when I get to it. So without further ado, let's go through the list. Number 1 is a live system. Now, this is a method as old as video games. It's not too much harder to implement than permadeath, and it adds almost the same level of tension as permadeath. In fact, if implemented correctly, it can be even more effective, since one of the problems with most permadeath boards, I don't know if you noticed this, they don't tend to indicate that they're permadeath before you die. So if you stick a lives counter in the corner, the player is always reminded that they have an incentive to play carefully. In addition to this, you could award point bonuses for each life remaining at the end of the board, which itself creates a further incentive to not die. It's a system that rewards good players, creates some forgiveness and accessibility for less skilled players, and provides an opportunity for creating secrets that matter to gameplay, without changing the combat balance. You can, for example, hide extra lives instead of hiding guns. And that way you don't have to, worry about the balance of your combat by sticking out a super powerful gun someplace. So the second idea I had was point reduction. Now imagine if the player could die as many times as they had to, but they lost, say, 500 points every time they died. They'll still beat your level, just like the good players do. However, the number of times they died will have an impact on their leaderboard appearance. This allows your good players to shine, while letting your lesser skilled players still finish the board and enjoy everything it has to offer. The third idea is the Walk of Shame. Now this one is a specific area of debate between myself and other map makers I speak to regularly. Basically, the Walk of Shame is the cute little nickname I've given to boards that have multiple lives and few to no checkpoints. The idea is if you die, then you have to walk your way back to the current theater of combat, either from the very beginning of the board or from an inconveniently located checkpoint. Now on the one hand, it is a tangible consequence for death. It prevents all those issues with the loading screen, it's deceptively easy to implement, and it gives players an opportunity to explore and even appreciate some of the areas they just fought through. On the other hand, it's pretty much the default method that SnapMap offers, so let's be honest, it's a little lazy from a coding and logic perspective. Plus, if you're not careful, you can end up respawning your player outside of a lockdown room, which is even worse than a defeat screen because the player is now stuck in a map they can't finish. So they have to manually exit. They create the exact same situation, except that it's even worse than if they just got hit with a defeat screen because, they're exiting a broken map. So point is, if you're going to go with the Walk of Shame method, then you do have to be very careful about your implementation, and you got to make sure players can't get stuck outside of locked rooms. Fourth concept is something I'm calling the soft reset. This is one I'm currently experimenting with in another one of my maps. It's inspired by the way Dark Souls handles death and respawning. See, instead of triggering the defeat condition, in the game itself, player death will just completely reset all the modules and encounters back to square one. If implemented correctly, a soft reset carries all the burdens of permadeath, but with zero loading time between one death and the next playthrough. This is admittedly the toughest one to implement and test, but if done correctly, you can create a challenging and rewarding experience that only ends when the player wants it to end. You could, for example, offer players an option at the finish line to try another run immediately. This would be an ideal mechanic for a self-contained roguelike style board, for example. It would be a great way to implement that. Fifth idea revolves around custom mechanics. You see, SnapMap's versatility gives you the power to create your own game mechanics, and with that, new opportunities to punish and reward players. I mean, one of my favorite examples, just off the top of my head, is Teufel's Domain. It's a map by Taylorhead, one of my personal favorites, despite all the swearing and complaining I do every time I play it. Anyway, the board is score-driven, and it gives players the opportunity to earn point multipliers based on, not getting hit and collecting certain collectibles, and it takes that multiplier away every time they get hit, and if you die, it resets the multiplier completely. Now, that's just one example, but what are some other ones? For example, if your board has a currency system in place, you could add a feature that makes the player drop some or all of their currency when they die. Maybe a board with RPG elements. You could dock some experience points or remove any buffs the characters earned. Basically, if your map has something that makes it unique, then it also has something you can use to give players an incentive to not die in it. The sixth idea is visible death counters. Now, a lot of players, myself included obviously, like to stream their plays or post them on YouTube, and dirty little confession time, it's actually possible with editing techniques to hide how many times you've died on a board. You can take this away from players by simply adding a counter in the corner that displays the number of times the player has died. So this way, players that complete an entire run of your board with that perfect 0 will have one additional element in their footage they can be proud of and a whole lot of bragging rights. One other thing I'd like to discuss is what I've been calling functional immortality. This is my dressed up fancy term for, whatever, infinite lives. Basically, the player lives, the player dies, the player lives again. This is, in my opinion at least, the best method by far if your board features a whole lot of, custom geometry and you want your players to see it all. But really what it reflects is a, screw it attitude. The idea is just let people play. Who cares if they die? It's, in essence, it's similar to the walk of shame, except maybe what you do is you actually do implement a checkpoint system. Just something to think about with that. Really, though, I feel like the important question you got to ask yourself is why? Why does your map need to punish a player that dies? There's some very good answers to that question, too. I mean, in my opinion, at least, it all boils down to the thrill of victory. You see, winning any game is only as thrilling as the consequences you avoid for losing that game. So if the goal of your board is to win, and the focus of the board is on making it difficult for the player to win, then a consequence for death is not only appropriate, I would argue it's downright necessary. On the other hand, though, you can also make a map whose goal is simply to be enjoyed. It's an experience, a showcase of fun things for the player to do. Excellent custom geo builds, compelling stories, fun and wacky mini games, examples of unique artistic vision. These are all just a few examples of maps you might make where the goal is simply enjoy your experience. If that's all you're going for, then basic mechanics aside, why even bother worrying about how you're going to punish a player for dying? But, obviously, this is all just my opinion, and I'd like to hear yours. What are some good consequences for death you've encountered in the maps you've played? What are some ideas you've implemented that work well for you? How important to your play experience is it to have these consequences? Let me know in the comments, and please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.